Free agency continues rolling on, and while the Chicago Bulls don't have very much spending power left out in free agency, there are a couple of Bulls players that still can make an impact before the season starts if they move to different teams. We're going to give updates on DeMar DeRozan, Zach LaVine, and Nikola Vucevic's situations and how it relates to the Chicago Bulls' future. We're going to get to all that and more right after this.
You are now tuned in to Chicago Bulls Central, your number one place for all Chicago Bulls news and content.
What's going on, Bulls fans? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bulls Central, your number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related. My name is Haize. More importantly, you guys can follow the channel at Bulls Central Pod on every social media platform. But with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it, man. So, of course, multiple updates when it comes down to the Chicago Bulls' former mid-3 players when it comes down to it. And, while we had breaking news episodes, yesterday on some of these topics, I want to kind of bring them all in one place, especially for the podcast listeners. I very rarely release breaking news episodes on the podcast feed, which I probably need to get better at, if I'm being 100% honest. But with that said, we got Chris Haize reporting that Chicago Bulls are interested in helping out DeMar DeRozan to find sign and trade options. One of those places that are interested in DeMar DeRozan services is the Los Angeles Lakers. This is not going to surprise very many people. The Lakers and DeMar DeRozan have always kind of had some interest. DeMar DeRozan honestly thought he was going to go to one of the LA teams before joining the Chicago Bulls. They didn't get offered much money. The Bulls ended up offering more. The rest is history. DeMar DeRozan finds himself in a very similar situation now in the fact that he turned down a 2-year, $80 million deal in total, because there has been some questions from Bulls fans on, was it $40 million in total or was it $80 million in total? It was $80 million total, $40 million per year is what they reportedly offered DeMar DeRozan, and he turned that down. And then now DeMar DeRozan finds himself in a situation where reportedly, again, this is all reportedly, he doesn't want to play for the mid-level exception, but that's probably where it's going to head. Now, if a team trades, and this is something that I did not point out, if a team trades for or does a sign and trade for a player, it has to be a 3-year deal at the mid-level exception. Now, only 1 year is required to be guaranteed, so the other 2 can be non-guaranteed. Theoretically, DeMar DeRozan can sign a 3-year deal at the mid-level exception this year with the team. They make the last 2 years opt-out years. He can opt out. He can be back in free agency next year. But the Lakers can only acquire DeMar DeRozan through a sign and trade at this point. So there is a projected deal out there that I'm going to go over, which involves a 3-team trade because the Chicago Bulls are hard capped, as we talked about in yesterday's daily episode, which drastically limits what the Chicago Bulls can acquire even in a sign and trade, but much less just anywhere overall. They are hard capped at that first tax apron. They can't go into the luxury tax. And so with that said, this is a deal that gets DeMar DeRozan to the Los Angeles Lakers. The Lakers received DeMar DeRozan, a 2030 second-round pick from the Pistons. So the Pistons are the 3rd team in this deal. The Chicago Bulls receive a 2025 second-round pick from the Lakers and a 2028 second-round pick from the Detroit Pistons. And the Detroit Pistons, in this case, will be receiving D'Angelo Russell and Torrey Craig. This is a projected deal. I didn't come up with this deal. This deal came from a Bleacher Report article. And I think this is the type of deal that you can expect if DeMar DeRozan is signed and traded. This gets DeMar more money than the mid-level exception. It keeps the Chicago Bulls without going into, which they can't go into the luxury tax. They can't take on more than about $14 million unless they include other players anyway. This gets DeMar DeRozan a little bit more money. It could also get him, it still could be a 1-year deal, but it gets him more in that 1 year. He can go back out to free agency. The Pistons in this case, that's where it's hard to gauge. And you guys know I like to talk about things from all aspects of the team. It's easy just to figure out a deal that just favors one team or another. But with the Detroit Pistons signing Tobias Harris, which could have just been a amount of money to get them to the cap floor, but considering they signed that veteran presence, adding D'Angelo Russell and Torrey Craig, 2 more veterans to that young team that can play multiple roles for that team, could be, if the Detroit Pistons are trying to win games, trying to improve and develop a winning organization there, which I have my doubts of if they're going to be able to do, this is the type of deal that could get that thing done, right? So I like the motivations for all these teams. They get some scoring. They get some offense with D'Angelo Russell. They get a veteran in Torrey Craig that's at the vet minimum that can play any role that you need him to play. the Lakers get their guy in DeMar DeRozan. They also kind of recoup a second-round pick that they're sending out. It's just further down the road from the Detroit Pistons, which with how bad the Pistons have been, that second-round pick could be pretty valuable. Same thing with the Chicago Bulls. Getting a 2025 second-round pick from the Lakers doesn't shape up to be some amazing type pick or anything like that, but also the 2028 second-round pick from the Pistons in there. The Bulls are basically getting something back without allowing DeMar DeRozan to walk for nothing. Now, that's the Lakers. Now, there's also the rumor that the Miami Heat have talked to DeMar DeRozan and that they expect to answer within 24 hours, a response or an update within 24 hours. And so the thing about the Miami Heat portion of it is that I don't see the basketball fit necessarily, but the thing that I always give is the Heat culture. I think that Heat can make things work that on paper look like they wouldn't work because of the culture that they do have there. And ultimately, it will come down to, again, what the Miami Heat would be willing to offer in the sign and trade. It's not like the Bulls are looking for a whole hell of a lot. They're just not. Now, could a third team get involved in that as well? Absolutely. I think that's kind of what the Bulls are going to be looking for if they do a sign and trade to try to avoid taking on more salary. And if they can create more roster spots, that may add more flexibility into what they can do in the Zach LaVine deal. Keep in mind, almost every Zach LaVine deal that we've heard means that the Bulls are taking back more than one player. We only have one roster spot open as of right now. We could create a second by waiving the non-guaranteed deal for Onolap Batum. But considering this team is going younger, I think that and needs three-point shooting, the team may be kind of valued more, even more than what he was last year for the Chicago Bulls, because he's one of the only players that looks to be an actual three-point shooter for that team. But again, even if they waive him to take advantage of the non-guarantee, they can immediately sign him back after, maybe waiving a player that they get in the Zach LaVine trade. There's a lot of different permutations that can get you there. But what would the Miami Heat be willing to offer for DeMar DeRozan and send out? They have all their two-way contracts are settled. They have a couple of players that are on rookie scale deals. Orlando Robinson is one. Josh Richardson, maybe they'd be willing to offer Josh Richardson, and him being over 30 years old. You're bringing in DeMar DeRozan, possibly. But everybody else on their roster, unless there's a third team involved, I just don't see them giving up. Tyler Hero, they need some three-point shooting, even if they acquire DeMar DeRozan. So I'm not quite sure there. Terry Rozier, I don't think so. Duncan Robinson, they may be willing to give up Duncan Robinson in a three-team trade where the Bulls don't acquire Duncan Robinson's contract. But then again, who's to say? Duncan Robinson is kind of insurance if Tyler Hero isn't healthy, which he's had injury concerns as well. So that's kind of what you're looking at when it comes down to it, I feel, when it comes to the Miami Heat. Of course, a lot of other options. You never know. Caleb Martin's there as one of their unrestricted free agents. They can look to maybe include him in a sign and trade. Maybe it's a dual sign and trade for DeMar DeRozan. I wouldn't mind Caleb Martin here to help be a veteran presence on that wing for the Bulls. But so right now, it seems as if the Miami Heat and the Los Angeles Lakers are the two most likely candidates for a sign and trade for DeMar DeRozan. That doesn't mean that it's going to be one of those two teams. As we know, in the NBA, things can be very fluid. Things can change. All it takes is one team to look and review their roster and say, hey, you know what? Actually, I think I actually want to go after DeMar DeRozan here. And, the San Antonio Spurs, a lot of people have mentioned because they are the only team with kind of the cap space outright to maybe sign DeMar DeRozan, them and the Orlando Magic. But I still don't even see them necessarily going in that route. So, the San Antonio Spurs, which were the youngest team in the NBA last season, to add Chris Paul and DeMar DeRozan in the same offseason would be wild. But again, you can't count anything out. This has been a wild free agent period. And really, most of the top free agents are done. Now, DeMar DeRozan is one of the best free agents left on there. Like I said before, DeMar DeRozan was 17th in the league in scoring last year. It's not like DeMar is coming off, being old and a bad season or being old and an injury. Yes, he's older. Yes, he's limited, but it's just crazy to see that this is where we are right now with the DeMar DeRozan saga. And this is something I'm sure him and his agent did not expect it to be at this place of where it is. I'm 100% sure of it, right? Because if they did, they would have definitely tried to do something different, you would think. So, the DeMar DeRozan thing needs to be a cautionary. We've talked about the Bulls front office being a cautionary tale of not knowing and understanding when to sell off your roster, right? When to move certain pieces. And that is that. This is very much so from the Chicago Bulls, and I hope that the front office and AK and Eversley are learning from this, using this as a learning experience. But this also could be a learning experience for NBA free agents, of NBA players, to understand you got to be locked in. You got to really, really gauge what that market's going to look like really good. And if you don't, it can get ugly for you. So, yeah, the Bulls got to get it together, man. And DeMar DeRozan and his agent, I'm sure they're sitting there right now looking at this like, damn, I can't believe that this is where it went. I can't believe that this is where we sit right now. Hey, gotta learn to play your cards right, man. But we'll see. There's a lot of still things left to be done, right? Lauri Markkanen is reportedly available in trades. LeBron James hasn't officially signed his deal, but he will. We're not even too worried about that one. But this free agency still has some things that could be that could make some splashes. And could DeMar DeRozan be one of those? I guess we'll take a look at that. Now, next up is the issues with Zach LaVine and the Chicago Bulls. So one of the things that we've heard around here is that Zach LaVine and the Bulls and the trust between the Bulls front office is shattered. This one was reported that that AK and Eversley, because of them misleading Zach LaVine on some possible trade destinations, it caused distrust by Zach LaVine and Clutch Sports, and that the Bulls have distrust because Zach LaVine decided to opt in for surgery when it was optional. That limited what they could move for him. And apparently, what the thing to get from this is that it seemed to be maybe a handshake deal between Zach LaVine, his agent, and the Chicago Bulls that, hey, we're going to try to work together. We're going to try to find a trade. This is what we're going to do. And then both sides moved in ways that were maybe more beneficial to them than what the initial kind of behind-the-scenes handshake deal was. And that's what it comes down to. And I talked about this. I did a bonus episode on this as well, is that when it comes down to it, everybody failed each other in this one. Zach LaVine did not live up to the contract. He just did not. And the Bulls front office didn't live up to a couple of things. They did not pivot well after the Lonzo Ball injury and put this team back in a winning situation. They initially built that team to get Zach LaVine to sign the contract extension to make sure they can lock him in. And they built a solid team overall, but they just did not continue developing that, right? As far as like putting the Bulls in a good place and pivot off certain things, adjust to injuries and things that have happened. And then it comes down to the distrust that Zach LaVine's had with Billy Donovan. Now, regardless of what area that you sit on that, this isn't that conversation. After Zach LaVine got benched, nothing was the same for Zach LaVine when it came to that relationship with Billy Donovan. And I'm sure that the Bulls front office and their love for Billy Donovan continue to cause a bigger wedge in that relationship. But as it stands right now, it just is that the relationship between Zach LaVine and the Bulls front office is shattered, is the buzzword that was used there. And it was even said that while there still is a highly likely scenario that Zach LaVine is back on a Bulls roster next year, or just at least to start the season, that is looked at as the worst case scenario by the Chicago Bulls front office. And so the Bulls are working diligently to try to find a deal for Zach LaVine. But as more and more players sign, as teams get closer and closer to setting their rosters, that's just going to become a more difficult proposition the further along that you go in it. And so, not to say that I want to see the Bulls take a bad deal for Zach LaVine, which they can only take so much of a bad deal. They don't have the salary cap to take on bad contracts. They're probably looking at expiring deals. They are clearly going younger in the roster as well. So even if Zach LaVine does come back, while he may fit into the play style, how prioritized is he going to be? I've always said, at least over the last few months, is that it's more scenarios exist if Zach LaVine coming back and hurting his trade value than him coming back and improving his trade value, in my opinion. I know not everyone agrees with that, but I look at it, there's only one scenario in which Zach LaVine comes and he boosts his trade value up. That's if he comes back and plays extremely well and the Bulls look like they're winning games because of his play. Now, with this team getting worse as far as going younger, maybe if the Bulls are losing that, they don't necessarily hold that against the whole perspective of Zach LaVine isn't a winning player, maybe. But if Zach LaVine comes back and plays well and the Bulls look like shit, that's probably going to affect his trade value. If Zach LaVine comes back and he plays okay, but maybe the young Bulls look better with Zach LaVine not on the roster, that could also hurt his trade value. And let's not even get into the fact if Zach LaVine even does so much as twist a ankle and has a mild ankle sprain, that teams will use it to look at as, oh, there goes those injury concerns that we've talked about with Zach LaVine. There's a lot of different scenarios that could end in this hurting Zach LaVine's trade value overall. But I think the Bulls sit in a place where they are just trying to grasp at straws to get Zach LaVine out of here, and they're just not having success. And really, that deal to the Golden State Warriors for a 1-year deal on Chris Paul, they decided to waive it instead of trading for Zach LaVine, somebody who could come in and be a catch and shoot player for them at the bare minimum. I think that was damning. That was damning, in my opinion. And so this Bulls team now sits in a place where you're trying to move somebody that everybody in the NBA now knows you're trying to move. He's 29 years old. He's about to be on going towards the other side of 30. And there's a big question in that. But let's not act like Zach LaVine. Over the past 5 seasons, Zach LaVine's averaged 25 points per game on 47% shooting and 38% shooting from downtown. Those aren't elite numbers, but they're pretty damn good offensive numbers. Now, some would say that, but Haize, the defense, but Haize, the attitude, but Haize, and you're right. And it's just like to hear that the Bulls, even in attaching a first-round pick potentially to Zach LaVine, can't move him. I just don't know if this thing gets done. I had thought for a while that maybe moving Zach LaVine after the first wave of free agency could be a thing where teams kind of see the players that they've missed out on. But it doesn't even seem like that's going to be an option anymore, right? This Zach LaVine saga is crazy. And the fact of the matter is that the Bulls are attached to 2 players that it seems like nobody wants at the value that they see themselves at. Zach LaVine, with that contract, I do think that Zach LaVine would have been moved if that contract wasn't as high as what it is for sure. But then outside of just that contract, then you got DeMar DeRozan, who turned down reportedly an $80 million deal and isn't going to get anything remotely close to that, it looks like, on the free agent market. And while he can help some teams, it's like the value he sees himself out versus where they see him at is like, it's the fall of the mid-3 is just crazy. That's just what it is. We are witnessing the fall of the mid-3, and I still think that is the best thing for the Chicago Bulls. Yes, they should have moved off assets earlier. Do not get me wrong. But the way that in the direction that this team is moving with their roster now going younger is still, to me, the best thing that you want to do and get those opportunities, those bites at the apples, and let's see what's going to develop here. But the last member of the core, the mid-3, whatever you want to call it, that we got to talk about is Nikola Vucevic. And I know this is the C-Dub segment. The Bulls signed Jalen Smith, who is shaped up to be a really solid backup big in this league. Outside of that, Nikola Vucevic has always been a question here on what's going to be the future of Vooch. I, for one, maintain that Vooch, without DeMar DeRozan, has an ability to be a more efficient offensive player just because of the spaces that they operate in that on the court. But again, that still does not do anything for the terrible defense from Nikola Vucevic, the way he gets cooked in pick and rolls. He's a solid on-ball defender, but that's really it. He's an on-ball defender, but in a league that it becomes more off-ball motions become more important, and being in pick and rolls to switch, and that just sits him in this place where it's a big question around what exactly is Nikola Vucevic going to be on this team going forward. And so hearing that there's growing belief that the Bulls, if they move off from DeMar DeRozan, are looking to trade Nikola Vucevic, which is still a questionable thing to me because we sit at this place now where there's not a possibility of DeMar DeRozan returning to this team unless he's willing to take less than the mid-level exception. That's the only way DeMar DeRozan can return to this team. That's it, right? So unless that happens, and less than mid-level exception type money is what I should say. If he's willing to accept a $12 million contract, because the Bulls do have that amount of space, which they can go over the cap to sign their own players, unless he's willing to take that, DeMar DeRozan is gone. So this growing belief that Nikola Vucevic could be traded if DeMar DeRozan leaves, I don't know how to feel about that because DeMar DeRozan is not coming back. And I think that you still want a starting caliber center. Now, unless the Bulls want to give a shot at Jalen Smith and Adama Sanogo and say, listen, you guys going to come into training camp. We'll see which one of you guys win the starting center position. You're both basically 6'9", so it's not like, Jalen Smith is actually 6'10", 220 pounds. But listen, these are going to be the centers that we roll with. Young guys we think can grow and develop with these young players. And if that's what they do, if the Bulls go into next season, moving Nikola Vucevic for pennies on dollar and start Jalen Smith or Adama Sanogo, that should tell you right there that, yes, they are still prioritizing development of young guys, but that top 10 pick, probably keeping that. And that's not to shit on Jalen Smith or Adama Sanogo. I like both these guys a whole hell of a lot in what they could develop and turn into and what they could bring to the team. But let's be clear here. at that point, the Chicago Bulls would be missing over 20 points per game in DeMar DeRozan, 18.5 points per game from Nikola Vucevic. Now they'll be getting better defense as well, but like that puts the young players into taking a lot of shots, which is what a lot of people do want, is the young players to be put in a situation where they have to take a lot of shots to grow and develop their offensive game, to get in that type of rhythm. So we are seeing the crumbleization, the crumbling of the core three. And some will say that it's long overdue. And a lot of those guys would not be wrong for this. And this is something that when AK came out after the season ended and said that changes were coming, and I saw you guys in the comments, a lot of you guys, oh, we know they're not going to do anything because they haven't done anything, whatever. This offseason has hopefully opened your guys' eyes up. Now, the question is how successful are they going to be in this? And that's the thing that AK and Eversley got to get back to showing vision. They have to get back to execution. They have to get back to all these things if they truly want to come out on the other side of this rebuild and have a team that's solid. And yeah, that means you got to get draft selection right. That means you have to develop players and do it at a really good level and invest into that development, which I do think that the Bulls have done. Getting a player development department at last season that really helped Io, that helped other players, even Kobe White with his shot, and then getting two now assistant coaches behind Billy Donovan that have both been heads of player development departments that have guided the development of players like Bam, players like Jokic, players like Michael Porter Jr., that have done those type of things. I think all pointed towards the writing was on the wall. This Bulls team has prepared themselves for a younger roster that needs to develop. Now it just remains to be seen of how well will they execute it. And let's hope that they execute it well so that we can have entertaining basketball to watch. And I do think that this team is going to be an entertaining team to watch next year because of the style of play. How successful they are in that's a story for another day. And we'll talk about that once this roster is finalized. But guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you guys are following the show at Bull Central Pod. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns. BullCentralPod@gmail.com. Lastly, if you want to leave a text message and our voicemail for the mailbag, the number to do so, 773-270-2799. We are the number one spot for everything Chicago Bulls related, thanks to you guys. And like I like to end every episode on, go Bulls. Love you guys. See red if you can, y'all. Peace.
This has been a presentation of the Break Media.